available right now on our YouTube channel, Irish Global Health Network. If you have any questions during the webinar, please use the questions and answer feature in the bottom of the screen. Today, we are excited to welcome our moderator, Dr. Kieran Harking, who is a family doctor in Dublin and co-founder of the Access to Medicine Ireland group. For now, I will hand it over to you, Dr. Kieran, to introduce the speakers and to lead the panel discussion. Welcome, Kieran.
Thank you, Hala. And again, welcome everyone to another webinar on conversations of COVID-19. We in Access to Medicines Ireland are delighted to have been invited to co-host this webinar. We're a membership group of COLOV and new members are always welcome. We have a very exciting panel of speakers today with a wealth of experience and expertise. But before I introduce them to you, I would just like to make some observations on the theme for today. With over 1.4 million deaths globally reported from COVID-19, we now have an end in sight, with 5 vaccines likely to be available within a matter of weeks. These vaccines are up to 95% effective, and while some need to be stored at -80 degrees centigrade, others can be stored in a regular fridge. Pfizer, BioNTech were first out of the block less than 2 weeks ago, followed by Moderna, then the British AstraZeneca vaccine, and now we have the Russian vaccine and Johnson & Johnson's vaccine almost ready to go. So this is all very exciting for us, and we in Ireland can reasonably hope that the vulnerable sectors of our population will be immunised before the summer, with mass rollout later in the year. Clearly, the health, social and economic benefits will be immense as we emerge from the lockdown. However, it is not only for reasons of common humanity, but also out of self-interests that we need to think about ending this pandemic on a global basis. There is limited benefit in extinguishing the virus in our country while it rages in other countries, because it will almost certainly come back. Unfortunately, experience with the last big epidemic showed us that millions of people in poor countries died annually as they were unable to access HIV medication, while at the same time, patients in higher income countries were living normal and healthy lives because they did have ready access. So the question for us on our panel today is, can we do better this time? So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers. We're very honoured to have Achal Pravala, who is a writer, researcher and strategic advocate for intellectual property reform and access to medicines. Achal has worked to drive change in the legal and policy frameworks that have underpinned the development and manufacture of medicines for decades, specifically in India, Brazil and South Africa. Isabel Simpson is an executive director for Medicines Sans Frontières, Doctor Without Borders, MSF, and has a professional background in nursing with over 25 years in humanitarian work. Isabel first worked with MSF as a medical coordinator in Bosnia in 1996 and has held many senior positions since then, including head of mission in Sri Lanka, Zimbabwe, Pakistan, Somaliland, and Iraq. Dr. Tahone has been a wonderful friend to AMI since its foundation 5 years ago. Ellen is the Director of Medicines, Law and Policy, a group of legal and policy experts offering advice to international organisations and government. She is the founder and former executive director of the Medicines Patent Pool, and is a fellow at the law faculty at the University of Groningen, where she received her PhD. In 2020, Ellen was appointed Officer of the Order of Orange Nassau, a royal award in recognition of her work on access to medicines. And finally, we have Dr. Aisling McMahon, who is an assistant professor of law at Maynooth University, specialising in medical and intellectual property law. Aisling has published widely within the leading international peer-reviewed medical intellectual property journals, including the Journal of Medical Ethics, Medical Law Reform, Cambridge Quarterly, and the International Property Quarterly. And only last week, we were informed that Aisling wrote a blog on patents for COVID that had been included amongst a short list of briefing papers to MPs in the House of Commons in advance of a critical debate. We are really proud to have Aisling as a member of Access to Medicines Ireland. So I'd like to start off really and ask Pravala to contribute, and I've got a few questions to each of the speakers, and my first question to Achal is, Achal, how do you expect the COVID vaccine will become distributed globally over the next few years, and what do you see as the barriers to distribution based on health need?
Thank you. Firstly, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be with such old friends and to make some new ones. Ellen and I are colleagues, and I respect her work very much, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from you and everyone else who's here. When we talk about vaccines, I think one helpful way to begin is by framing the problem. So far, we've had 3 vaccine results formally announced, and those are the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines and the AstraZeneca vaccine, which soon followed. Yeah. In the best case scenario, so this is if Pfizer does everything that it can, they'll be able to produce 1.3 billion doses of this vaccine by the end of 2021. Moderna has an estimate of between 500 million and a billion. AstraZeneca has a little more. AstraZeneca can make about 3 billion with contracts around the world. And so let me just tell you what that means. So what it means is that for Pfizer and Moderna, these are vaccines that have been funded over 100% by rich countries, including the EU, so which is of relevance here because of who we're talking to, but also by the United States. Even the countries that funded the development of these vaccines, that paid billions in pre-orders to receive these vaccines, will not receive vaccines anywhere even close to satisfying the requirement of inoculating every single person inside their borders. And so this should strike us as very strange, right? When you pay billions out, you don't even get back enough to inoculate your own population. Forget about the rest of the world, which has absolutely no access to this. So with Pfizer and Moderna, the situation is that the richest countries in the world have a place in a long line, and the poorest countries in the world have no place in the line. They can't even approach the line. Yeah, AstraZeneca has done better, and we should credit them for it. They've set up these partnerships with a number of different vaccine manufacturers in Argentina, in Mexico, in Brazil, in India. They're considering partnerships in China, Russia, and South Africa. They will be able to produce more vaccines as a result. But it's the gold standard in the pandemic right now. Let me tell you what the gold standard looks like. At the end of 2021, they will have enough vaccine doses at best to inoculate 20% of the world's population. This is in, by the way, 1 year and 2 months, right? Which is a long time away. And that 20% is not even equally distributed. So it means that poorer countries will get less than 20% and richer countries will get a little more than 20%. This is the very best situation we have today. And to me, that is a frightening prospect. And I think in my world, best illustrates the problem of access to vaccines. And the problem to access to vaccines really comes from 2 things. It comes from monopolies, which are expressed with intellectual property like patents, and a more insidious form of intellectual property, which goes by the name trade secrets, which play an outsized role in the category of drugs that vaccines fall under, which are called biologics. Yeah, and our failure to address these problems, despite evidence of 20 years of failure and just as intense a crisis, except unfolding in far corners of the world, in South Africa and in India and in Thailand and other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, has meant that we are, unless there is very serious action taken right now to correct the situation, we are at risk of repeating exactly the crises that we've had to live through where millions have died. You're on mute.
There you are. Sorry, Achal, thank you very much. And can I ask you just to follow up? Do you have suggestions as to how we might do better?
One of the early suggestions that gave a number of people who work like me on access to medicines and have worked from the time of AIDS to the coronavirus pandemic was CTAP. CTAP is the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool, which I should just mention is the largely uncredited work of Ellen, who is going to be speaking a little later and who you'll hear from. CTAP was launched with great fanfare by the WHO, supported by the governments of Costa Rica, by dozens of developing countries. And it was quite heartbreaking to see that at the launch, you had all these small nations who are not the poorest countries in the world, but who are by far the most frightened, because when you're so small, your revenue is small, you have absolutely no access to the pipeline to get into this line, to get access to these vaccines. The fear was palpable. CTAP was a project by which, foolishly imagining that the pandemic might be a shared burden that every single person on the planet faces together, would be an opportunity for the people who have these solutions, vaccine manufacturers, treatment manufacturers, to come together and say, look, here's our technology for stuff that's been approved. Let's put it out here. Who else can make it so that we don't have these sickening shortage of supplies, by which they could share orders and figure out a way collectively to make enough of these things for everyone.
Okay.
So it was launched, except that the WHO hasn't really done very much to push it. And as a result, it's just sort of stayed in limbo. One very exciting proposal came up at the WTO. So the way that monopolies are regulated, of course, is through trade law. And trade law has a sort of super governance model, which is a trade rule at the WTO called TRIPS. And India and South Africa proposed in October that TRIPS should be waived during the pandemic, which is a perfectly sensible proposal, right? Because there's nothing in any kind of logical framework that makes sense to continue punitive corporate monopolies at a time when people around the world can die of them, because they've been dying of them for a long time. It's just that it's not been in places which are typically covered by the Daily Mail. So this proposal was floated in October. Now over 100 developing countries have supported that proposal out of about 165 member countries at the WTO. Every rich country and Brazil, inexplicably, has come out in opposition to the proposal. And but if there's still a little time to discuss this through, and I sincerely hope that for the first time in these last 20 years, that developed countries, the richest countries in the world, the EU, the US, can understand that it's not actually in their charitable interests merely to allow this waiver to pass through, but it's in their interests.
Yeah.
That they're not actually getting nearly as enough of the treatments and vaccines that they've paid for multiple times. You know, I do think that if you're in the pharmaceutical industry today, the US and the EU must be really the world's best customers, because they just give you lots of money and expect nothing in return, right? You know, it's like getting money to build a house. And then once the house is built, you have to negotiate a separate contract for the keys. And once the keys are negotiated, you have to negotiate a separate contract for how long you stay there. It is really that absurd.
Right. Okay, I thank you very much, Akhil, and we will be picking up on those points about CTAP and the waiver in a few minutes. Thank you. Isabel, can I ask you to comment from an MSF perspective? I know that MSF has strongly pushed and supported the waiver, the South African waiver proposal. Can you tell us a little bit about how MSF sees the challenges to rolling out COVID vaccine globally?
Thank you, Kieran. And yeah, thank you so much for inviting Médecins Sans Frontières to participate today as well with such distinguished panel of colleagues. For MSF, the challenge and imperative has to be to ensure vulnerable communities living amidst health emergencies and in humanitarian crises, or people in low and middle income countries, can get access to these vaccines. One clear challenge is the race to buy up the available stocks of vaccines. We already know that an estimated 85% of the projected initial doses of the Pfizer vaccine has been sold to high-income countries, which only leaves a very small slice of their production capacity for other countries. We also need these vaccines to be suitable for use in different populations and settings. Again, in practical terms, Pfizer, Moderna vaccines, they need to be stored at very low post-freezing temperatures, which would severely challenge many of the cold chain management facilities that we have in the settings where we work. And aside from the challenges of availability and logistics, I think one of the biggest issues is around transparency. There needs to be transparency on all vaccine licensing agreements. And only with this transparent approach can we have mechanisms established which will provide equitable global access. The COVID-19 has put a spotlight on some of the access challenges that MSF has seen for years. Pharmaceutical monopolies leading to high prices, limited supply, lack of transparency on research and development, clinical trial data, manufacturing costs, and lack of suitability for settings that are not considered profitable. I think the COVID pandemic has presented all of us with challenges that we haven't faced before in our lifetime. And it's crucial now that these low and middle income countries also have equitable and timely access to the vaccines. Otherwise, COVID will remain a threat for everyone.
Thank you. And Isabel, can I ask you, how reassured are you by statements from, say, WHO, COVAX, that vaccines will be made available for lower income countries, and by pharmaceutical companies that they will reserve a certain proportion of vaccines specifically for lower and middle income countries?
We would like to be able to say that the COVAX facility will solve this problem, but we have raised concerns on this initiative before, and we still have concerns now. And in short, we just don't know whether the commitments from some pharmaceutical companies will actually go far enough. COVID is presented as the big solution to our calls to ensure vaccines get to low and middle income countries. But we do challenge this, and in a way, COVAX is still functioning during the pandemic as if it's business as usual, and it doesn't demand transparency from the manufacturers. Another inherent problem goes back to supply. When the supply is used up by higher income countries, what is then left for the lower income countries in the COVAX facility after that? On the subject of AstraZeneca vaccine, we do very much welcome the commitment from them to sell the vaccine at no profit during the pandemic. And of course, it's also much more stable and can be used at normal refrigerator temperatures, which is very good news for many of the countries in which we work. But this all comes with strings attached. And as disclosed by the Financial Times, terms of a deal with AstraZeneca show that there are limits to their public no-profit commitments, and that the company has given itself the power to declare the pandemic over as soon as July 2021. That means after that date, they can charge whatever price they choose for the vaccine. And these are all details that are never made public, and we don't know what else is hidden within these agreements.
So, in addition to transparency, Isabel, are there other key things you think we should be doing or what needs to be done in your view to ensure equitable rollout?
Governments need to take responsibility for the billions of euros in public money that they've handed over for these vaccines, by demanding that the pharmaceutical corporations urgently make public all the license agreements, the clinical trial costs, the data, manufacturing costs, etc., and also link this up to technology transfer as well. I think it's Moderna, they have stated that they will waive their patent during the pandemic, but in many cases, the patent alone without technology transfer does not improve production and manufacturing possibilities. Médecins Sans Frontières strongly advocates that there should be no patents in a pandemic. And as I said, of course, this also needs to be coupled with technology transfer. And this is really important to increase the production, the manufacturing, the supply capacity, both in the long and the shorter term, to prevent countries adopting vaccine nationalism and hoarding, particularly, of course, the high-income countries, and to redress this power imbalance created by a lack of transparency and accountability. Furthermore, the WHO initiative clearly spells out these needs as well, but there's no concrete mechanism that will ensure the implementation. That's all still a bit unclear.
Okay, Isabel, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And it's really interesting to just see MSF clearly have got a history of delivering and with their feet firmly in the ground. Thank you. That's really, really helpful. Ellen, can I turn to you? And I don't actually have a farmer hat, but if I did have a farmer hat, I might be saying, hey, this is actually, what's the problem? The system is working really well. Within 10 months, we've got 5 effective vaccines. Companies are competing. There's an effective market. They're bringing the price of the vaccine down to €3 each. The WHO has stepped up, and COVAX there's a mechanism to ensure that a reasonable share of vaccine goes to lower and middle income countries. And the pharmaceutical companies themselves, or at least one pharmaceutical company, is agreeing to reserve a significant proportion of its vaccines for lower and middle income countries. So what's the problem? The system is working really well.
Thank you, Kieran. Yes, you would do wonderful as a lobbyist for the pharmaceutical. That would be the day. First of all, let me say it's great to be with all of you, and lovely to see you again. And I long for the days when we can meet in person. Now, with regard to the system, actually, when this pandemic outbreak became apparent, no one said, we've got this wonderful system, let's just sit back and wait for the system to deliver all these vaccines. The exact opposite happened. Governments immediately stepped in and started to spend billions on the research and development of these vaccines. The system of developing these vaccines at such a rapid speed, and let's hope and pray that indeed they will be as good as the press releases promise, because so far, of course, the actual scientific data has not been disclosed, and the regulatory agencies still have to look at that and give their judgment. But if these vaccines indeed become available and are as good as they seem, it is because the government stepped up and spent billions to make sure that the research necessary to develop them would happen. Now, not all of these companies have the same approach. The AstraZeneca has a different approach, for example, from Moderna. Moderna's first statement was, we're only interested in the North American market. They weren't even thinking internationally. Now, that is an attitude. I think they're changing their attitude, but that, of course, is an attitude that should absolutely not be allowed if you hold a vaccine or a medicine, for that matter, that is so important in a serious health crisis like COVID-19. The pricing is, we have to sort of wait and see what the companies are doing with the pricing. The Pfizer pricing is much higher. Pfizer asks $15 per dose. 2 doses are necessary, so an entire vaccine costs $30. It's not clear yet what the Pfizer price will be for low and middle income countries. Now, COVAX would indeed deal with an international procurement and an international equitable distribution of the vaccines if all countries would collaborate. But what we've seen is a complete sort of almost schizophrenia between what leaders of high-income countries are saying and what they are doing. We heard Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel talk about the people's vaccine. This should be a global good. No one should own the vaccine. There shouldn't be monopolies on the vaccine. And I think we felt very much encouraged by that. I think some of us thought naively, maybe this crisis is the crisis that will indeed change the way this is being done, the way these vaccines are going to be developed and made available. But at the same time, these rich countries did not commit to procure through COVAX. They quickly start to place their own orders and got themselves first in line with their advanced market commitments. Now, Seth Berkley, the head of Gavi, which manages COVAX, has recently said that if the first 2 billion doses, would be distributed proportionally over the planet, it would reduce deaths by 61%. If monopolized by the 50 richest countries, which is pretty much what is happening, that reduction will only be 33%. So again, not all is well. I think COVAX has some promising sort of potential, but it is potential. The other issue is the so-called middle income countries, which is a significant group of developing countries that often falls between the cracks, where you see sort of charitable approaches toward the lowest income countries. These middle income countries are often left to fend for themselves without actually having the resources to do so. So the other speakers talked a bit about the CTAP and the waiver, and if you allow me, I would like to say a few words about that, because it really is very important that we continue to put pressure on governments and on corporations, as well as research institutes, to make CTAP work. CTAP, the Technology Access Pool, is the mechanism to share the intellectual property and the know-how, in fact, foster collaboration between the companies that hold the knowledge of how to make these vaccines with other production facilities, production capacity in other countries, many of them in developing countries, that could help to increase the production capacity. There are different stages in this pandemic. I think everyone is very much focused on sort of the immediate crisis situation, but we also have to think about what's going to happen after that. And for that, we really need an investment in production capacity, because there is simply not enough production capacity on the planet. And it's likely that these vaccines need to be repeated and will be necessary in many years to come, which will require a dramatic increase in the production capacity of vaccines, which in the end would not only be good for combating COVID-19, but of course for vaccine production and availability more globally. Now, CTAP, as other speakers have pointed out, so far remains empty. I hope that will change, but that partly explains the call by developing countries such as South Africa and India at the World Trade Organization for a slightly less voluntary mechanism, and being able as a government to say, we're not going to enforce the TRIPS requirements because we need to be able to make our own decisions in this crisis. And that is, of course, very much behind the call for the waiver of the TRIPS agreement for countries that wish to do so. Over.
And can I ask you one final question? I suppose, just looking forward, what implications do you think will the current pandemic have on R&D, research and development in the future?
Well, I hope that some lessons will be learned. The other day, a journalist called me about, I was very surprised to get a call about something else than COVID-19, that doesn't happen these days, about antimicrobial resistance and the lack of the development of new antibiotics. And he said, what do you think needs to happen? I said, well, look at COVID-19. Why are these vaccines coming out of the pipeline? Because lots of money is thrown at it. So the role of upfront financing, make resources available for health technologies that are necessary, instead of sort of wait and see whether they will be developed by commercial corporations who simply have different objectives, unless you give them the money to do it. That is, I think, an important lesson that we could learn and could be applied in areas where there is huge unmet need. There is, of course, fabulous results in the non-for-profit drug development sector, such as the Drugs for Neglected Diseases initiative, which in fact works on such a model. But we now see that played out on a much larger scale with COVID-19, with one huge exception, and that is that there are not sufficient strings attached to this funding. Since this R&D is paid for, there isn't really a need for excessive pricing, well above production costs, because the R&D costs are already covered. So those vaccines should actually be much cheaper, or most of these vaccines could be much cheaper than they are today.
Okay, thank you, Ellen. Can I just say at this point that we have 10 or 15 minutes at the end of the last speaker for questions and answers. There's a chat function on Zoom, and if anybody's got any questions you'd like to put on it, members of the panel, please do so. Aisling, can I know intellectual property rights is your bread and butter. Can you tell us why they're so important when we talk about access to COVID vaccine in Ireland and globally? Why all the talk around IP rights?
Yeah, so thanks also for inviting me today. It's wonderful to be with such distinguished speakers as well. And as the others, as Ellen and Akal have already mentioned, and indeed Isabel, intellectual property rights are really important. And that's why I think many of us are very concerned about how vaccines are likely to be rolled out. So in simple terms, if, as others have mentioned, IP rights, like patents, what they do is they allow the rights holder, so the pharmaceutical company, for instance, to stop others using their technology. So that could be a vaccine or a drug. So essentially they make the patent holders, the pharmaceutical companies, becoming gatekeepers of the technology. That's really what's happening in these contexts. And that means that they can stop others using their technology. So they can also, for example, if they have a patent over an element of a vaccine or a diagnostic, like a test for COVID, they could stop others manufacturing that. They could kind of that could potentially have a knock-on effect in the manufacturing capacity. They could also then put themselves in a position where they become the sole provider of the technology. And as others have mentioned, that can then lead to kind of a monopoly scenario. And we know, monopolies are bad for pricing. We know that means they can charge higher prices. And that then, of course, will have devastating impacts, particularly for lower and middle income countries in terms of the price, but it also will have important impacts for higher income countries in terms of supply, because if they refuse to allow other manufacturers to manufacture these vaccines, that could, that's even assuming we have the supply chain, but that will inevitably have a knock-on effect in supply. And I think it's important to highlight, as others have said, that this is not a hypothetical. We have seen these issues play out in the past in the HIV/AIDS crisis. We've also seen them currently in controversies, for example, in the UK around access to cystic fibrosis drugs like Orkambi. We see them day in, day out in access to cancer drugs. And we also have unfortunately seen some of this play out in the COVID-19 context, even before we get to the stage where we have an approved vaccine. So in March 2020, just a few examples, in the US, there was claims that arose that one diagnostic company that was producing COVID diagnostic tests basically were challenged. There was a patent litigation that was allegedly being challenged for them to stop producing those because they were allegedly infringing another company's patents. Now, that led to huge, understandably, media backlash, and subsequently the challenge was dropped, so nothing came of it. But it does highlight a very significant problem, in the middle of a pandemic, that a company would think it right or appropriate to even suggest that type of challenge. And the other scenario that we saw in March, I think, or later on in Italy, again in the height of the pandemic, where the hospitals were filling up, we saw in that context others challenging. There was a group that were allegedly printing valves for 3D printing valves for ventilators, and there was a question around whether or not they had been challenged by a patent holder in terms of whether they were infringing their patent. Now, subsequently, that was kind of dismissed and refuted by the individuals and by the patent holder in question. But it does also raise an issue because it's entirely legally plausible that that could happen. And this kind of shows the problem. And again, we see these issues playing out in the vaccine context where, as others have indicated, there's already so many advanced purchase deals. Over 80% of the supply of the Pfizer vaccine, which is likely to go to, on the current deals, to 14% of the world's population. That's a shocking statistic, and that's also not only not in our interest, it's in no one's interest, because everyone must be vaccinated to come to the end of the pandemic. So I think IP rights are really important, and unfortunately, certainly in Ireland, I don't think the mainstream media is really picking up on the importance of these issues for access downstream, particularly now as we reach this fantastic news of having some vaccines that are hopefully going to have very positive results and be approved for use. I think you're on mute, Kieran. Yeah.
Thanks, Aisling. Thank you very much. And in terms of what's happening in Ireland, as you're aware, the Access to Medicine Ireland group have campaigned. There has been a push to try and get Ireland to sign up to CTAP. Can you tell us, where we stand at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So Access to Medicines Ireland, or AMI, are actively campaigning for the Irish government to support the CTAP initiative, which, as Ellen has outlined, is an initiative that we really feel is very, very important and is one that all governments should be supporting. So far to date, we were very pleased to see that President Michael D. Higgins, at the end of September, in his speech to the UN General Assembly, he supported the initiative. He also talked about the need for solidarity, the need for countries to come together, the need for unity, actually facing this pandemic. I think very sensible and very appropriate words. And also, as part of that, he discussed the WHO's CTAP initiative and indicated his support for it. However, what is disappointing, I suppose, since then is that the Irish government has not actually formally supported the initiative, and AMI and others would like to see that happening, would like to see the Irish government and indeed other national governments supporting initiative. To date, I think there's 40 governments that have supported this globally, but of those, only 5 EU countries. And we think that Ireland should actually join those countries and support the CTAP initiative to encourage pharmaceutical companies in Ireland that are based in Ireland and indeed elsewhere to also support this initiative, because it's in all our interest to get to the end of the pandemic. And there's a number of reasons why, as Ellen has also outlined, we believe the Irish government should support this in terms of helping to increase the manufacturing supply, in terms of getting to the end of the pandemic as soon as possible, in terms of helping to accelerate research. CTAP can facilitate all of that, and it also goes much beyond just suspending patent rights, which is an important part of the piece, but it doesn't offer the full tech transfer that CTAP can offer. And for those reasons, we would, in AMI, strongly encourage the Irish government to formally support it.
And finally, Aisling, is there anything else you think that the Irish government can do to ensure that intellectual property rights don't become a barrier to fair access to medicines?
Yeah, so just briefly on that, CTAP is kind of the initiative that we feel should be strongly supported. But if that doesn't receive the support that it needs, then at the moment it hasn't received that support yet, but we are hopeful. We do think there are needs for other measures like the waiver. So the Irish government could support the waiver proposal, which is suspending patent rights, and also try and seek to encourage tech transfer with that. But if that's not successful, and even more generally, I think we do need to ensure that all national governments have appropriate and effective compulsory licensing provisions, which mean that countries could step in to mandatorily license patents where needed, for instance, in a public health scenario. And we do have those measures in Ireland at the moment. They are there, but they could be more effective. So some of the measures in Ireland are somewhat bureaucratic, perhaps more guidance is needed. They haven't been used that much in Ireland in the past, these provisions. And also there are ways in which I believe the system could be reformed. Other countries have already done that, like Germany, Chile, and elsewhere, to make sure that those laws are effective if needed for COVID-19.
Okay, Aisling, thank you very much. I've got a few questions from viewers. Breda Gahan has asked a question for all panelists. Africa looks to China, Russia to boost scant vaccine supplies. Is this a concern for LDCs and possible exploitation? Would anyone like to take that? Achal?
Sorry, no, actually, I was going to respond to another question. I was just volunteering to respond to another question on what equity in distribution means. That was posted on the Q&A, I think. I think that we'll address the first question that you raised in other queries, perhaps.
Okay. So I'm not really great at, didn't figure out how I was going to do this chat. It's a question from Sue Ming Hu to all panelists. Thank you for this excellent panel question for Dr. Hone. What strings could be attached to corporate manufacturers and pricing, and what scope for price reduction would they afford?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think with regard to the comment on the China and Russia vaccine, these vaccines are not submitted to the US FDA and to the European Medicines Agency, and that is why I think they haven't been part of this conversation. But you're quite right to point out that those vaccines are there and they're being deployed. But the same standards for transparency and open and the need for openness with regard to the efficacy and safety, of course, applies. I expect that the WHO will also play a role. The WHO will play a role in the international validation, pre-qualification of vaccines. So we'll see some action there. With regard to the strings, it would be very important if donors, so for example, the European Commission, would say, as part of the funding contract, if you develop knowledge with these, with the funding that you are receiving, that knowledge need to be shared on a wider scale with others to enable others to reproduce or produce the invention. That could have happened with the vaccines. The European Commission does have a manifesto on its website in which they actually say that. They say we call on our grantees that if you carry out research and development with funding from us, that you share the intellectual property and the knowledge and collaborate with others to enable scale up of production. But that is a voluntary manifesto on a website, which is not the same as conditions actually written in a contract when you hand over the billions. So that is the kind of strings that I'm talking about. The European Commission just published its new intellectual property strategy, and it has some very interesting language on this, which I think we can take as an encouragement. The Commission recognizes that the current mechanisms for sharing of IP and access to IP, particularly for health reasons, is not strong enough. Which indicates that they are going to work on strengthening that further. And they also make reference to international voluntary pooling mechanisms that they should be made to work. So that all points in the right direction. But of course, you have the leverage when you spend the money. That doesn't mean that all is lost. Of course, these governments can make demands. We've seen that with the medicines patent pool, when governments stepped up and said, we actually want this to happen. We want our companies to do this. We want you to work with the medicines patent pool. Companies did. So that is something that needs to happen in this area as well. Over.
Thank you, Ellen. We have a question. Please, can we have a ground rule for what is meant by equity and distribution of COVID-19 vaccines? There's too much focus on developing versus developed countries, and the question thinks it's old-fashioned, and would like to see what the panel think.
I could take a stab at that, if I may. Yeah.
Achal, yeah?
Yes, okay. So, that's a fundamental question, right? And no one is saying that 100% of poor countries should get the vaccine before rich countries do. The way that this has been worked out, the WHO has something called a global allocation framework. And the rough calculation there is that a sort of standard of high-risk people constitutes about 20% of countries' populations. These are healthcare workers, people with comorbidities, and senior citizens. That formula sort of falls apart in countries with high income inequality, because you have, where I live in India, for instance, a large number of people who would not fall under those categories formally, but whose income disqualifies them from being as safe as they should be in the pandemic. So they are high risk by virtue of being low income. And I think that is the situation across various other places. So I think this is a very basic framework and it needs to be expanded. I don't think anyone is saying that the allocation should be unequal. I think the problem there is that Moderna, for instance, 100% of its supplies of the 1 billion vaccines it can make until 2021 are already promised. In fact, they're already sold to the US and the EU, right? 82% of Pfizer's vaccine has been sold. There have been many calculations done primarily by Oxfam and a campaign that it runs called the People's Vaccine, which is very smart, and I urge you to check out. where if you're in a rich country, your government has actually bought multiple vaccines, which means that roughly, depending on what works, you'll have a choice of about 7 or 8 different vaccines in much higher percentages than just the basic 20% that needs to be inoculated. The COVAX facility was meant with the WHO to sort of drive this global equity in how vaccines are distributed. And at that, I have to say they have failed utterly, because the companies have done their own deals with manufacturers. The manufacturers are certainly not following an equitable allocation framework. And what it means is that it's a joke, actually, the way that it works right now. So what we're fighting for is for equal allocation, right? To make sure that a bare minimum has access to this vaccine, for the allocation of the vaccine to be driven by need rather than by how fat your pockets are, which is exactly how it's proceeding at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else like to comment on that question? No? Okay, the question from Rosie James. Rosie wants to know, how can we ensure that pharma companies are not having discussions behind closed doors, presumably fixing prices? And are there any legal mechanisms to enforce transparency and accountability? How could you, Rosie? Right.
I have a sarcastic answer to this. I have to just say, I actually do wish that they would have some conversation behind closed doors, and I'll just tell you why. The data is so confusing. Both Ellen and Aisling have talked about trade secrets, right? One of the reasons that we don't know anything about how to fit the vaccines together with the treatments is because all of that data is considered by these companies to be trade secrets, which they cannot cooperate on, right? So you had the whiplash-inducing situation of Gilead's remdesivir being the only treatment for COVID, which then became approved fully by the United States FDA at exactly the same time as the WHO ran a larger trial saying that it has no effect on COVID whatsoever, right? Nobody has any idea what to do with multiple vaccines, whether to take 1 or 2 or 3, or what the AstraZeneca results mean. And that's because all of these results are being stored at the companies in those vaults as trade secrets. They're not being shared. And so I really wish they would have more conversations, actually, not on price fixing, but just on comparing their results and collaborating a little.
Thank you. Thank you, Akal. And we have 1 or 2 minutes left. Question, probably for Ellen, doesn't the TRIPS agreement provide for the generic manufacture of medical products supplied specifically in low or middle income countries?
I guess that question is about how much flexibility does the TRIPS agreement provide for to enable generic manufacturing, even in cases where patents exist. And Aisling already talked about compulsory licensing, which is one way of enabling generic manufacturing in the case of a patent barrier to that. Also, through a compulsory license, you can enable importation if a product is made elsewhere and you would like to have access to it. So that is another way. There are other exceptions in the TRIPS agreement that could be used and that have been used in the past. For example, the research exception. There's a broader, more blanket type exception in the TRIPS agreement, Article 73B, which could be used in a COVID-19 situation. It is the security exception, which would almost have a similar effect as what a TRIPS waiver would be. Now, the political consequences of doing that are huge, and countries will be wary to invoke Article 73. I would think, if you look at under how much pressure they come when they use compulsory licensing. But having said that, the If you look at the history of HIV medicines, before the medicines patent pool was operational, it was the use of government use, which is a particular version of compulsory licensing, that where the government uses a patent for its own purposes, for example, procurement of medicines, was used on a very large scale to access the low-cost production of antiretroviral medicines from India. But again, with regard to the vaccine, as Achal and others have pointed out, the access to the patents is not enough. You need to have the deeper technology transfer. You actually need to have the collaboration with the rights holder, with the originator, so that the vaccine that is produced or reproduced is the exact same vaccine that is covered by the registration paper, so to speak. So patents will be part of that, but that is not the only thing, and that is why compulsory licensing in the area of vaccine has its limitations.
Thank you, Ellen. And one final question from the audience: what about the responsibility of the ethical responsibility of BioNTech, Oxford, and other universities to ensure ethical rollout of their vaccines once approved? Any comments? Achal?
Yeah, just to step in, look, I think that BioNTech and Oxford are slightly different. BioNTech was always set up as a private biotech company, and so it was intended to make profit. But that's a very different kettle of fish to Oxford University, which was purportedly not set up merely to make a quick buck, right? So, except what's happened is that, since the 1980s in the United States and in the United Kingdom and the European Union, there's been an increasingly push to get universities to commercialize their research in whatever area, but especially in technology and in the pharmaceutical scientific industries, because that's where the most revenue stood to be gained from. And so if you look at the way that Oxford has done this, this is following a long, illustrious line of forebears who've done this in the United States, where very essential drugs have been developed through brilliant science at university medical laboratories, which really qualify as public institutions. And what has happened is that they have been then spun off, like Oxford's was, to a company called Vaccitech, which is a joint venture between Oxford and some of the the individual inventors of this vaccine, which then struck the licensing deal with AstraZeneca and then funnels money back in a sort of joint agreement, partly to Oxford and partly to themselves. So this is very much the direction of the research. But I think as an ethical responsibility, universities have a far lower tolerance for bad PR. And, we saw this with Yale University in the early 2000s with an AIDS drug that they had the rights over. And I think that there's a unique opportunity to get Oxford to put reputational pressure on Oxford to get them to do absolutely the right thing with this licensing deal that they have.
Okay. Achal, thank you. So we are now in the wind down of this webinar. I would just like to start the wind down by asking our panelists just one very 30 seconds or so to make any final concluding remarks. Isabel, would you like to any final thoughts?
Yeah, I simply want to say again, no patents in a pandemic. Nobody can afford to let the pharmaceutical industry monopolize life-saving medical products to pursue their bottom line without regards to the global COVID-19 needs. Thank you.
Thanks, Isabel. Ellen?
Yes, thank you. I would like to build on that slogan from MSF to say no monopolies in the pandemic, because there is so much more where we need access to, and I'm encouraged that it's possible because of the financing of the innovations. And I would like to call on everyone to sort of join the movement for the people's vaccine. And if you are in a position to put pressure on your government or on people who lead pharmaceutical corporations, to encourage them to make sure that the WHO COVID-19 technology access pool becomes a success. That pool cannot remain empty. But it will need some political mobilization for it to fill up. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Aisling, you'd like to, any final thoughts?
Yeah, just to kind of build on that, to support those statements. I think we are, facing, this is a crisis, and a time for crisis is often the time for action. So perhaps it's also, I think, important to reflect on government's roles in this context and to think about what they should be doing in future if we've, hopefully this doesn't happen again, but just generally in terms of health financing. Money was given in this context in many cases without strings attached. What can be done about that in future, and also what mechanisms can we now support, like CTAP? So I would also encourage others to support that and to make sure we have effective mechanisms.
Okay, thank you, Aisling. And Achal?
Thank you. When the pandemic started, I felt that there would certainly be exceptions made for the pandemic because it affected all of us and it's so big. And I felt like my fight was to ensure that they did remain exceptions just for this pandemic, but that were applied to cancer and hepatitis C. 6 months in or 7 months in, we're just fighting to live in the pandemic. So frankly, that's been disappointing. But I think what's hopeful is that now every single person in the world, my parents, understand what I do, finally. That people now finally care about access to medicines, and that's an amazing thing. I would personally like to see Europe, I'd like to see Ireland and the EU take control of the Pfizer vaccine. Pfizer has received $500 million in direct loans from Germany and the EU, and $2 billion in pre-sales orders. This is the European vaccine. Take control of it.
Achal, thank you very much. I suppose I'd just like to start by thanking our speakers. I'm thinking this time last year, we would have had, to get speakers like this, we would have had to write them and book them in 6 months in advance. And it's just fantastic to get speakers of this quality and expertise to come and be with us. I know it's not the same as being actually in the room and with us, but it is fantastic. And I'm also conscious that for you get you must get dozens of such requests every week, and thank you very much for fitting us in among your busy schedule. I'd also like to thank everybody at home and at work for giving us their lunch hour. And it's not that easy a topic, linking, but sure, we can all get the vaccines, but making the link between intellectual property rights, which seems an academic subject, and actually making that meaningful and turning it into an everyday, really important thing to understand, takes a bit of effort, a fair bit of effort. And thank you very much for staying with us. And thank you very much to the Irish Global Health Network for inviting Access to Medicine Ireland to co-host this. So, and I'll now hand you over to Hala.
Thank you. Really, thank you very much, Karen. And thanks also to all our speakers for this great discussion and insights about vaccines accessibility with relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. Also, thanks to all our attendees for joining and interacting during the webinar and for asking questions. We hope to see you again in our coming webinars. The recording of today's webinar will be included in our YouTube channel, a newsletter and website, Irish Global Health Network and Easter Alliance. If you are interested in finding out more about the Access to Medicine Ireland, or you're interested in joining their group, please email accesstomedicine.ireland@gmail.com. Thanks again, everyone, and have a lovely weekend.